when you find yourself energized to take out this other group or whatever that's evil, you're involved in shadow projection.
Welcome back to MindMatters, everyone. Today, joining us for the first time, we have Colin Davis of Shadow Tech Alchemy. We'll have links to Colin's website in the description, as well as any other links he gives us during the show. Colin is the author of a new book coming out. In fact, by the time that we publish this, it will be out. So check the links in the description to get it. It's called Transforming Darkness, a Shadow Work Toolkit for the Red-Pilled Initiate. So welcome to the show, Colin.
Thank you, Harrison. Thanks for having me.
You reached out to me because you found that we kind of have some similar interests and some similar research focuses. And in this book, which you've provided to us to take a look at, for this show, you get into a lot of cool stuff. Your focus is, I'd say, probably primarily Jungian, but you use a number of different modalities or just frameworks, psychological frameworks, including ponerology, which is kind of my wheelhouse. Yeah. So maybe we could start out. Maybe give a little bit of background on yourself. You're also a musician. I'm also a musician. Yeah. You probably are more into it nowadays than I am, but yeah, I'm a guitar player. And
me too.
And so
I listen to music.
Yeah, Alan listens to music. So give us a bit of background. Where you came from, how you got into this kind of stuff, and then your site's called Shadow Tech Alchemy, and this book's on shadow. The psychological shadow. So maybe get into what exactly that is, and then we can go from there and how that leads into everything else.
Right. Okay. Well, so how did I get interested in talking about the shadow or ponerology or human evil, human darkness, that whole thing, and the psychology of it and all of that? It's what if we start from when I got involved with being a musician, and there's artists and a lot of musicians in my family, especially on my mother's side. But my mother's father was a jazz musician, and his whole family were as well. But I got into metal music when I was like 12, 13 years old, and started playing guitar at that time. And what I was naturally attracted to, my brother was he went with punk music, him and his friends. He's 2 years younger than me. And then I went with metal with Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. And then I found out about Slayer and Metallica and thrash metal and all of that. And so that's what took my energy. And so I just progressed on the path of a musician and putting together bands. And I moved from Austin, Texas to the Bay Area, California Bay Area, when I was 20. And there was a huge metal scene there at the time. And so I was just involved in that as much as I could be. And eventually I put together a extreme metal band or death metal band called Vile, which still exists and we still play, although not as often. I'll be in Europe playing a festival in July, actually. So that I could say that I started touching on the area of a lot of the subject matter that's in the lyrics of extreme metal bands is all shadow stuff. It's all about the dark side of the human condition, and although I never was into the artwork as much myself personally, I mean, it's sort of I actually pulled this out for this. You probably can't even see this, but this is somebody's mug from a Nice to Eat You Death Fest. Right? And so there's this whole genre and milieu, and if you look at the art here, there's some kind of, parasitic sort of demon feasting going on, and this is what's in that's the that's that area. And so they're exploring the human shadow through art. And so that's the first place I was touching on this. My dad was also into Philip K. Dick, and when I was very, very young, he probably was reading some Carl Jung and stuff like that. And so I think there's also Carlos Castaneda and Joseph Campbell and all that kind of stuff, sort of metaphysics. So I kind of have in my background, I have the dark music, and then I have the metaphysics and spirituality aspect in there. And but I didn't really start to go into the psychological side of it until I was 35, which would be about 19 years ago or something. And I had a big crash, and you could say it was a typical kind of dark night of the soul or midlife crisis. And it was at that time and there was a number of different inputs, as there always is in these life stage transitions, that kind of conspire to knock you on your ass. And it was at that time that I pulled out a book off my bookshelf that had been given to me by a friend of mine who had also moved out to California, who I grew up with in New York. And the book is called Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson. And my friend actually he knew Robert Johnson. And so that was sitting on the bookshelf, and he said, because my friend recognized my my interests and stuff, and said, you might, here's my copy of this. You should check this out at some point. So that was kind of there, and I never really looked at it that closely. And then I pulled that out, and when I did that, that's when everything kind of dawned on me that behind my personal tragedy, behind my personal situation, was all of these unconscious factors that were coming to the fore that I didn't know about, and that I am sort of implicitly knew about. Everybody knows intuitively when they're shoving stuff into the closet. When they're saying, yeah, I have this issue, so to speak, and but I can't deal with that right now, or I'm very reactive in this way, and yeah, it's just part of me, or I don't like the way I blow up, or I don't like the way I have these cycles of depression or whatever, and but you don't really know what to do about it. Maybe somebody seeks therapy if it's really bad, but usually for a long time, especially until you get into your 30s or 40s, you're kind of just throwing it into the closet and closing the door and it's just back there. And when you have a crash, all that stuff floats forward. And if you're introspective enough and sort of, I guess, destined for a self-realization path, then you say, okay, I've got to start inventorying this stuff that's back there and that I've been throwing in the, it's like taking all your garbage, and instead of taking it out to the garbage, you just put it back in the closet and let it fester. And so with that book, that's kind of got what got me into the Jungian way, and got me aware of the fact that I have a shadow. I have and I'll talk about, how do we define the shadow? But it's basically, a simple way of saying it is it's what's in your blind spots. And so that's kind of how I got into this. And there's something deeper. The Jungians talk about what they call the big S self. And this is sort of there's a number of attributes to this structure in the psyche, but one of them is that it contains the pattern or the pathway to your destiny. And it's sort of like everybody has the idea is that there is an inbuilt potential or destiny that could manifest in your life if the conditions are right, or if you help it along, if you become aware of it, and there's all kinds of reasons why or why not, your destiny, quote unquote, might be thwarted. But you could say that your fate gets in front of your destiny, maybe. But it seems to me that this to understand the dark side of nature, to understand the dark side of consciousness, to understand how evil works and all of this, and to demystify evil and the shadow is part of my path. It's just like anybody else with a talent or a career and a life path. It's just in my path, but it takes a certain amount of time and focus and personal experience and introspection before you can really before this can crystallize and to a point to where you can actually explain it and actually do something with it, because it's psychological, and you can't really have an objective view of the psyche using the psyche as the instrument of measurement. So it's something that you have to have a lot of experience with and sort of see at different angles, and you have to see it reflected in society and all of this before you can kind of finally go, oh, I kind of get this. And so it's taken me a long time to really get it. And I think actually with this new book that's out, this is kind of a reiteration of what was in my prior book, Shadow Tech, but it's been crystallized a little bit more. It took another 9 years. I mean, I put a lot of this material out 9 years ago, but it took another 9 years for me to actually even really be able to crystallize it more to where I can really solidly say, I have my finger on this thing.
Right.
So there's some background for you there.
Cool. Well, so in the book, it's almost like a holistic look at evil, because some of the traditional approaches, or maybe not necessarily traditional, but just the main approaches, like there might be the kind of the external view of evil, where evil is all those other people, right?
Yes.
All the people I don't like.
That's the default.
And then that's the default. And then there's there's the view that that evil is kind of, I see there's almost a tendency to see evil as completely evenly distributed. And the advantage, I think, of your book and the way the ideas that you give is that it's not either or. That you're very open to kind of like not only the nuances, like you've got the Solzhenitsyn kind of vibe of the line between good and evil cuts down the heart of every person. It's like, that's true. Yeah. But it's also true that some people, that line is a lot further to one direction than the other. Right. Because we just have to look around in the world and see that, some people, when it comes down to it, they might have their flaws, but there are people that live their entire lives, like, if they're not saints, then they're at least just decent people that have caused very little, like, intentional harm to others. And then there are other people that might live short or long lives that it seems like their lives are just completely devoted to, like, to hurting and destroying and taking and lying and cheating, right?
Yeah. Right.
But your approach is kind of to look at all of these, but with the starting place of the self. Because regardless of the evil of other people, you're kind of saying the impression I get, the message I get, if I could distill it down to one sentence, is regardless of all the evil out there, we can understand it. But even in order to understand that evil out there, and in order to do something about it, we have to start with the work on ourself and seeing how we manifest evil in certain degree, to a certain degree, or in certain ways, to understand how that works. So maybe you could touch on that a bit. Like, we might be able to get into some more on, like, the shadow itself. So, like, what is the shadow, and how does that play into just evil in general, like on a personal level and externally?
Right. Okay. So first, a comment on what you had said about different kinds of people and how that their interactions with society are either, okay, so if we look at sort of the spectrum of symbiosis in the biosphere of different organisms, you can see predation is on one end and mutualism is on the other end. And so and as human beings are quite variable in how they work out ways to interface with with the outside world and with each other. And so, yeah, you'll find psychopaths, right? And they're going to be more on the predatory side. And then there's going to be, the whatever, the Mother Teresa type or whatever, that's, on the more mutualistic side. But we're all, it's like I'm looking at the backyard right now, and there's all kinds of creatures, and they're getting along in all kinds of different ways. And we could look at that and go, okay, well, these spiders or these snakes or these certain types of animals, predator animals, are doing it in this way. And we find that to be very disgusting. But then there's other animals that are just, or plants or whether they're just absorbing minerals. We find that to be cleaner. It's a subjective perspective. And it's, parasitism is the most prevalent type of relationship profile in the biosphere. And so if you look at the evolution of different organisms, the ones that, last for a long, long time, hundreds of millions of years, you'll see that organisms go through different stages of development. And you could maybe track how that, in this stage, they're more parasitic, and then over long periods of time, they sort of tuck in to their ecological community, and then they become more mutualistic. So perhaps human beings are just at a certain stage of evolution, and maybe, are eventually are more predatory and parasitic ways of being. We might grow out of those and become more mutualistic. More symbiotic, you could say. So that's there's that. There's also the fact that you might say, okay, well, somebody who thinks of themselves as being a moral person and trying to do good, and maybe with some self-awareness and all of that, is saying, okay, well, I'm not an evil person. This person over here, this Jeffrey Dahmer type or whatever, this is clearly an evil person, but that's not me. But we're all participating. And so, when you shop at Walmart, or spend your, work for such and such corporation, or work for the government or whatever, how much are you actually contributing to this destructive output? What's your responsibility there? Just because you're not being expressly, evil in your own personal life, how are you sort of latently contributing to the sort of parasitic structure of civilization, sort of to the matrix, or however you want to put it. So I think we're all in this together, and we're all contributing to one degree or another. And for the most part, we're not aware of how we're contributing. No one's really taking an inventory of their own behavior and going, okay, well, I can see how I could be more symbiotic here or here. I mean, a religious, moral, a moral structure or canon or whatever that says these are the sins and these are the goods, and paying attention to that is kind of a keeping track of an inventorying of your symbiotic relationships. But we're also not even seeing the world objectively. We're all projecting. Are you guys familiar with Donald Hoffman or Bernardo Kastrup?
Kastrup, yeah.
Yeah, so this is like subjective idealism or whatever. Kastrup uses the understanding that the model that we look at what we see out there in the world that we perceive as the objective world is kind of like an aircraft pilot looking at gauges and going, okay, this is where I am. And they could actually fly by just looking at gauges and meters without having to look out the window. And that's how we're biologically constructed. We're not actually seeing an an objective outside world. We're seeing a facsimile. We're seeing a constructed overlay that our senses are giving us this sort of simulated overlay, and we call that the objective world that we see. But even just physiologically, biologically, we're not interpreting the external world accurately. We're interpreting it to a degree that works for us and has worked for us evolutionarily over long periods of time. So when you look out in the world and say, this is evil, this is good, you're using a moral construct to be able to organize that, but you're not even seeing reality objectively anyway. So everybody has to take a step back, and nobody really has a good objective perspective of really anything. And so we all have to kind of go, okay, we don't know, and really kind of back off. And especially, this is where we get into the shadow and we get into projection. When you find yourself energized to stop evil in the world, when you find yourself energized to take out this other group or whatever that's evil, you're involved in shadow projection. And we can get into that. And so you're definitely not seeing the outside world objectively. You're projecting, and you're definitely seeing well, I guess I should, just to explain this, I guess I should probably just get into what the shadow is and how that works, in the psyche and Jung's understanding of this. Is that what I should do?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one quick comment on before you do that, on something that you'd said about the person who sees themselves as a good person but isn't aware of basically their own participation because they can't see it. And I'd say there's another level to that too, of the person who and I think this applies to everyone to a certain degree, some more than others, but there are people who have a picture of themselves that is totally at odds with reality, with how they actually are, right? So this will be an illusion that we have about ourselves. So we might see ourselves as a good person and say, "What? I'm a good. Look at that person; they're evil. Look, I'm a good person." And meanwhile, everyone in their life would be like, I'm not quite sure about that, right? So that's actually going to get into some shadow aspects because. Well, we'll see the connection as you're getting into what the shadow is and the kind of stuff that gets put there, right?
Yeah, that's Jung's idea of the persona, that we carry around a persona, meaning a mask, so that we have a socially acceptable mask, and the way we dress, the way we talk, the way we carry ourselves is in line with some kind of a role. And so we say, okay, I'm Joe, and I'm a policeman, or I'm a firefighter, or I'm a this, or a politician, or whatever. And this is how we act, and this is how we dress, and this is how we talk. And since I do those things, I'm in this. This is my role, and I'm good at what I do, and people recognize me as good at what I do. And you just kind of your consciousness kind of just floats at the persona level. And it doesn't really float down below the persona level too far for too long to find the contradictions between your actual inner nature and what you're showing to the world. And so that is actually what happens when you have a crash, when you have like I called it, a dark night of the soul. When you have a crash, an ego crash, then all this contradictory material, or what we call shadow material, is coming up into consciousness, and it's oppositional to what you're holding in your persona, the way you would like to believe you are, and the way you would like others to believe you are. And that's where you are going to have a big problem. And so what it is that this idea of the shadow, it's sort of a development of Freud's understanding of the id, but Carl Jung took it much further. So the idea is that to have consciousness, what in Western psychology they call the ego, is not, I point this out in the book. In Eastern psychology and yoga, a lot of terminology is used about the ego, and you want to get rid of the ego, and because to have an ego means you're egotistical or whatever. That's not the way it's seen in Western psychology. The ego is just your consciousness, your personal awareness. You wake up in the morning and there you are and everything, and you have your memories and you have your ability to have a contiguous waking state of reality. That's your ego, your personal consciousness. And to have personal consciousness, it would be impossible to have the kind of construction that we have now as human beings if we didn't have this kind of boundary field that separates conscious awareness or ego consciousness from the rest of the unconscious. Just think about all the unconscious processes that are going on inside of the psyche. It's like the body or whatever. And there's all these different bodily functions that are going on, and there's some kind of psychic or psychoid, Jung would say, kind of interface between the mind, sort of the software of the whole thing, and the biology, the hardware. And you can't have all that kind of stuff rushing into consciousness. So there has to be some kind of a boundary field that separates the conscious mind from the unconscious mind. And that is the field or the boundary field that separates the unconscious from the conscious, the ego from the unconscious. And the way it's constructed now is that if you're healthy, if you're psychologically healthy, you go along in life, and what's in your consciousness is, what's in front of your face, and, whatever the errands you have to run today are, you're supposed to get a call at 3:00 and you got that, or whatever it is, or maybe, some music comes on and it reminds you of your high school days and whatever. That is a healthy interaction between unconscious processes and conscious processes, and they're just interacting and they're doing their thing and everything's good. So you have right now, if you're healthy, that boundary field between the ego and the unconscious is keeping down the unnecessary or maybe caustic material, and then it's allowing necessary material to come up, like a needed memory or whatever it is. But this idea of the shadow is that there's any sort of thought or feeling or impulse or psychological drive that is in the unconscious, that's part of your makeup, it's part of your human biological makeup. But if it were to make it into your ego, it would shock you. It would harm your view of yourself. We're talking about the persona earlier, and the mask you want to show to others. If some of this human unconscious material were to just rise up, easily, it would destroy your relationships with other people, and it would destroy polite society, so to speak. Because the ego has to shove down, it has to repress, in psychological terms, any material that is destructive to your conscious state and to the organized society at large. So what happens with that material? And that's what Jung called the shadow. It's pretty much anything in terms of psychic material, feelings, thoughts, impulses, images, drives, anything psychological that poses a problem to your waking consciousness, to your ego and to your persona. And if you use a Freudian terminology, there's a related idea called the superego, which is sort of your inbuilt programming that your parents and society gave to you, programmed into you, that tells you what the rules of behavior in the world are. And so if you have all kinds of unconscious material that naturally would break those rules, what are you going to do with it? And so it either has to be repressed, or it has to be somehow displaced out into the world, or in another term, sublimated out into the world in some way under some kind of cover or some kind of rationale, so that this psychological energy can get its way out into the world, because otherwise it eats you up, it eats you alive. So this is a sort of foundational problem of human consciousness at our current level of evolutionary development. To have organized, polite, civilized societies, we have to repress our primal nature, and we also have to repress anything that maybe arose through childhood difficulties, psychological wounding from difficulties in early life, or what was passed to us from our parents. So we have all kinds of yucky stuff in there, and we don't have our way of dealing with that. The way the psyche has to deal with that is extremely primitive still. And so this is where we get into projection and displacement or sublimation, and ways that the psyche deals with having this repressed dark energy that somehow has to be dealt with.
I I look forward to hearing you develop projection in particular in this discussion. Yeah. Before we go there, though, Colin, wanted to comment on the fact that your book is focused on and dealing with a very specific cultural subset. The title of your book, Transforming Darkness, a Shadow Work Toolkit for the Red-Pilled Initiate. And, we appreciate that more than you know.
And I appreciate you guys and what you guys are doing more than you know as well.
The thing is,
we're right there. Yeah.
We are right there. And when you have that in the title, it implies and suggests all kinds of things. Red-pilled. So we're open to the validity of conspiracies, of darker political realities, of all kinds of things that the so-called normie would or might reject out of hand. Right. Now, I want to connect that for a moment to your discussion of the dark night of the soul and this deep unconscious shadow that seems to exist in all of us to one degree or another. Because, I insofar as I've ever experienced a dark night of the soul, it's months of pain. It's months of realizing things on a personal level that, for me, came flooding out and took a good deal of work and pain and emotion and grasping for understanding of. And it seemed to me that in your description of your own tragedy of 19 years ago, whatever that was, that it was in part perhaps a catalyst for you and a drive to understand yourself.
It was. Yeah.
But it also seems to me, because when this happened, I was already steeped in a lot of material that almost completely shook the foundations of my understanding of the world. And I was already years into reading material and sifting through it and trying to be as discerning as possible, but also understanding that, holy shit, this is, my perception of the world as it was is much different than how things actually are.
You mean you were already in the process of being red-pilled at the same time that you had this personal dark night of the soul?
Exactly.
Me too.
And one of so one of the points I wanted to make is that it seems to me that to some degree there must have been some kind of correlation between this external search that was the catalyst or impetus or drive or flipping of the switch or opening of the door to my having to see within. And so that was something I appreciated about your book, that you if you're doing this in the balanced way, it doesn't have to look like a miserable dark night of the soul. We all have different makeups and experiences and genetics and what have you. But it seems to me that there is, at least among a lot of us, the need to face those uglier parts of our unconscious when we're looking at the red-pilled material.
Yeah. So the way I would maybe respond to that is in the Jungian tradition, which is really the alchemical tradition, the Hermetic tradition. The dark night of the soul is the Negrito period in alchemy, and it's an initiation also. So you can look at the dark night of the soul through the lens of the archetype of initiation. And if you go back into the archetype of initiation, if you go back into, let's say, early human societies, indigenous societies, and see that the way they use initiation, community initiation rituals to turn boys into men. Women have their own, actually childbirth is sort of its own initiation for women. But for men, the society has to, the shaman, the ritual elders have to basically scare the living crap out of the boys in order to wake them up into manhood. And it appears that unlike animals, which genetically kind of click through these different levels of development into adulthood automatically, we do that until a certain level, to a certain age, let's say adolescence, and then initiation or advancement becomes sort of a cultural encoding. You need interactions from society and from culture to get this to work. So there's a Jungian named Robert L. Moore, he's a big influence of mine, and he says that if your society is not initiating you, your body will seek it one way or another. Your body will try to initiate you. Initiation is so archetypal and so tied in to our structure, to our genetics, that when it's time for you to click into a more adult, more mature phase, you will be shown, if you knew how to look for the signs, you would see that. But the thing is that it's always like with any kind of initiation, and red pilling, political red pilling is an initiation. You don't want to go through, it's like people won't join, not enough people will join the army. They have to be conscripted because nobody wants to go through the pain of what it takes to grow up, to go through these stages of initiation, these initiatory stages. So there's this waking up process that's already just sort of an archetype in human beings. And the dark night of the soul is the impetus for us to move to a new, more mature stage of life. And it doesn't look the same. People have different kinds of constitutions, and some people can click and go, oh, I see. I was being immature or naive or whatever in this way, and now I'm getting this job offer, I'm getting this opportunity to go into the army or to do this or to do that or whatever, and I'm going to take it. And I'm just going to go with it, and then things just click, And then within a few years, you're not the same person that you were anymore. Life just presented the opportunities to you, and you took them, and the initiation process worked, and you moved to a more adult or a more mature stage without a whole lot of problem, really. There was conflict, but it wasn't crazy conflict. And then you have people that are experiencing a so-called spiritual emergency, and you have the dark night of the soul that lasts months or even years, and the kinds of moral conflicts that are going on, and the kind of the kickback from your child parts, so to speak, that don't want to grow up and everything. And it just can be the most long, drawn out process. And a lot of people don't even do it. They don't even make it. They just start drinking, taking drugs, or whatever it is. And they kind of just stay. They take the blue pill, so to speak. They're like Cypher in the Matrix. They're like, they want out of here. And they don't realize that if they will just stay the course, this whole process will grow them up and change them, and that it's a process that it needs to happen. And our current day society is not giving people that message. That's a lot of what the Jungians were doing, is giving that message to people, is how to navigate this natural, what Jung called individuation, this natural alchemical unfolding that's happening all throughout life. So there is what you're talking about, the dark night of the soul, its relationship to psychological development, its relationship to alchemy, and to archetypes and structures of the human being that are always there. And so then there's this, what Arthur Verschluss was calling the political red pilling. And this is where you're getting all the, all this sort of, a lot of it is sort of right of center kind of political activism. They're talking about the deep state and the swamp, and they're talking about all the sort of parasitic features of civilization, and clean up the swamp and all that kind of stuff. And, this is where you're getting 9/11 truth movement and all the people who were pushing back on the C-19 situation that we had a few years ago. That whole thing. And what I said in that book is that I said maybe we could kind of split up this initiation, this natural red pilling process into an external mode and an internal mode. So let's say you take the red pill, and you could take the red pill into the political side of things, and into the political Gnosticism, or whatever you want to call it. And be red-pilled through, let's say, 9/11 research or something like that. Or you could be red-pilled through a breakup in a relationship, or loss of a job, or a severe health issue, or something that plunges you into a psychological dark night of the soul. Or those can be combined at the same time, like you said, Elon, was your situation and was mine. And the way you go, when you fall down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and you recognize that, hey, wait a minute, reality as I thought it was. I thought I was seeing reality objectively, and I found out that there was this whole underworld. And that underworld can be that sort of archetypal underworld, or unconscious, conscious kind of split there. That can be viewed exoterically or esoterically. And so the individual that says, wow, there's evil in the world, and it's systematized, it's integrated into the structure of civilization, and there's all these psychopaths out there, and there's all this parasitism going on out there, and I got to do something about this. I got to wake up others, or whatever. I put on the glasses, and now I have to, get others to put on the glasses, like you guys were talking about with Arthur from the movie They Live. And so that's an I called that the culture warrior, the red-pilled culture warrior. And that is maybe the default. And if before we had this current movement that was going on, I think this experience will be different for every generation. Every generation or era will have its kind of own version of this. But there's that exoteric culture warrior side where you recognize evil is in the world and I need to do something about it. And then there's the internal esoteric warrior, what I called the psycho-spiritual warrior, or the alchemical, what did I call that? The psycho-spiritual alchemist role, I said, or wounded healer, spiritual healer. This role, this is where the person says, oh, wait a minute, there's an underground, there's a dark side in me that I didn't know about that now is coming to the surface. Like you were saying, Elon, when you're in that dark night of the soul and all this previously repressed material was making its way into consciousness. That's what's supposed to happen in that mode. And so if you point yourself inwardly while you're having one of those red pill awakenings, you will discover you'll discover your own unconscious. You will discover your own shadow. You will discover your own inbuilt darkness or evil, however you translate that at the personal level. And so that's the kind of the two sides of it, the external and the internal. And sometimes they're going on simultaneously. Sometimes somebody's focusing, they're being sort of a keyboard warrior and sharing online memes or whatever to wake other people up. And at the same time, they're doing some kind of shadow work practices in their own time, and they're trying to, understand what's going on in themselves. And unfortunately, in our time, we have a lot of examples and leaders who are showing us how to do the external culture warrior part, but we don't have hardly anyone showing us how to do the internal awakening or initiation and development. That's not the Jungians. That's their corner. That's what they should be doing, but they're not there. They're not red pilled. They're not there. They're just, we have some, the best Jungians, probably the most profound Jungians have died. And some are still awake, but the older you get, the more you kind of get your reality tunnel becomes crystallized and calcified into what you believe. And so now I think part of also what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, well, that's part of what I'm, there's the activist side of what I'm doing with this book is to try to get other people, to entice other people to get into this field and to pick up this science and start to use it for themselves and use it to explain the world and use it to navigate their own difficulties in life and to individuate, as Jung called it, to evolve yourself as a human being.
Well, I want to make some comments on these the kind of internal external division that you've been talking about, because you make at various points throughout the book, just here and there, you make some interesting, like you mix the terms. So you borrow the terms from one realm to apply them to the other. And I thought these were really cool. So like, was it the shadow that you called the inner deep state? Yeah. Yeah.
Your inner deep,
so, I mean,
mm-hmm.
Right. So you look out in the world and you see, oh, there's a deep state. And then it's like, okay, oh, well, hold on a sec. I've got a deep state with so there are these analogous, analogous concepts, right? So just like we have yes, I'll start this way. Just like we have a deep state, there's a deep state out in the world, and you can see one and ignore the other. And then you talked about like inner false flags. So so the red-pilled, political Gnostic will look out in the world and say like, "Yo, false flag, false flag." Well, there's actually, if we take those dynamics and put them into the internal individual, we can see the same thing. So what was the inner false flag again? Was that the autonomous complexes?
Complex. Yeah,
I think that's what it was.
That's where you find yourself triggered, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something something your partner said that touched on something sensitive. It's something that you're just doing. You wake up and you find yourself in a more irritable mood than usual, and it sort of becomes, you end up blowing up at the cashier, it's at the store or whatever, or you end up getting into a car accident or whatever, and then you're just crying on the couch at the end of the day going, man, what the hell happened to me today? You get thrown from side to side from these inner complexes, we could say, and they're driving you in some destructive direction against your will. And so these are, so I would say that these are internal. Now, I explained in the book the internal family systems model. I used a number of models to help understand this dynamic of how there's active players, you could say, in the subconscious, in the unconscious, that are actively seeking. They're trying to get energy off of you through stimulating you to go into this direction or that direction, and they're injecting scripting into your psyche to trigger you into. I mean, with personal relationships, it's a perfect example. Especially if you have an intimate personal relationship, and one partner is like, why are you so angry today? Or why are you being so rude to me today? Well, I'm not being rude. You're the one that's in the crazy mood today. I am not, blah, blah, blah. And you say, well, I saw you, or I heard you say blah, 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 blah. And the other person says that I either didn't say that, you just made that up, or that's not what I meant. I clearly meant such and such. You just interpreted it that way. What's going on inside of there? What you find is that there's an operation going on that is cycling in and out of your life over the course of hours, days, weeks, months. Everybody's got a different kind of life cycle of one of these systems that is seeking conflict. And it can be a system. Eckhart Tolle calls this the pain body. It can be a system that is likes to get attention from external conflict, or it can be a system that likes to get attention through self-destructive, self-deprecating, masochistic, addictive kind of inward-facing conflict. You'd attack yourself. So either attack others or you attack yourself. And either way, at the end of the cycle, you're crushed, and this system is getting fed. And that's so that was what described in the chapter about autonomous complexes. And I brought in Jung's understanding of that. I brought in Eckhart Tolle's understanding of that, and I brought in some other. Talked about Paul Levy's understanding of what. Yeah. He brings it into actually. It's much more broad than that. We could talk about his. I think his work is incredibly important. But so that's the inner false flags. But what you were saying, Harrison, before that about the inner deep state, outer deep state, this is the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, right? Mm-hmm. And so, it's the first Hermetic maxim, and for a reason. And we call it, me and Melissa, we call it holon jumping. And are you guys familiar with Ken Wilber's work?
Just on a very basic surface level. Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, he's got a lot of core concepts that are very important, and one of them was used in this book. I used his 4 quadrants model to frame the shadow and shadow work. But he talks about it was Arthur Kessler's concept of the holon, which is I don't think I'll go into it too deeply here, but that there is a self-similarity in nature of the way nature structures itself, where the sort of archetypal example that Ken Wilber gives is the let's say the nuclear proton and neutron and electron, the atom structure, and how you'll see the atom structure repeated in the planetary structure. And then you might even see that repeated in other relationships, like we even call our own structures or social structures, the nuclear family. And so you have sort of a natural repetition, a sort of not fractal, because a fractal is a exact repetition of a pattern at different sizes, whereas in this case it's sort of there's a kind of an archetype or a Platonic idea, that a Platonic form that has a general shape to it and then manifests repeatedly, modified for its particular conditions. And so when you know that this as above, so below, or holarchy type of patterning is happening in nature, if you will, and this is current day science doesn't work with this, and they're missing out, because if you know that this sort of fractal type metastructure, meta patterning is inherent in nature, and that that's a clue. That's a major tool that you can use, because then you can say, okay, well, I can't see this domain here because it's outside of my field. It's in the unconscious, or it's outside of my ability to see. So, but then you would say, but what do I see about it? And you'll say, well, I see this particular shape. And you'll say, well, where else do I see that shape? And then you can find where that shape in nature exists in other ways, and you can study it, and then you can get sort of a general understanding of that archetype of that shape, and then you can apply that understanding to the situation that you're working on to give you clarity about something that you can't see. So once you know that sort of as above, so below type structure is going on in nature, then you can say, okay, well, I can't see the operations that are going on in the shadow of the unconscious, but I can see what look to be similar or self-similar activities or patterning in the society and in the culture, and maybe in other natural systems. And so I can now superimpose what I learn about those onto this other structure that I'm trying to understand. And then also when you realize that the way we construct culture and society in general is through projection of our own internal makeup onto the world, you have to suppose that the outside world is some kind of a reflection or projection of the state of affairs of the internal world. It has to be that way. And this is where Jung comes in. But and so now I can go, oh, okay, this sort of self-similarity is happening. These relationships are correlatable, and then I can go, okay, well, how convenient that if I've fallen down this rabbit hole and I'm looking at all of this sort of deep state stuff and false flag terrorism and all this other kind of psychopathology and all this stuff that's going on out there, how can I take that and superimpose that onto my own internal structuring and find out how the operations of my own psyche work? And so that becomes a science in itself, where you can say, okay, I'll take this domain of my own internal condition and I'll model it after what I see outside, out there. And so that's kind of what I did with this. I'm always doing it. It just becomes, and Ken Wilber's understanding has these different stages of psychosocial consciousness. This will be considered second tier. This is sort of a systems view where you're just naturally inclined to look at things in systems and correlations between systems, and as above, so below, or it's the law of correspondences, it's also called, is sort of it's just implicit in your way of working. And so, but I've noticed that there's not enough of that going on. That's another group, the integral community, that also really could be interfacing with with us, and they're not either. So we're going to have to kind of borrow from these other communities and bring it into our own community.
Yeah. Well, going up even a bit further than that, I think you even make this this comparison in the book. So the dark night of the soul, we could look at the personal dark night of the soul, but then a civilizational or cultural dark night of the soul, right?
There you go.
So
As above,
these
so
are some
below.
of the these are some of the things that Lobachevsky talked about, because he's talking. He's got a whole chapter on essentially civilizational cycles.
Yes.
Which he correlated with the like hysteria and symptoms of hysteria, which we could correlate to like panics or manias or paranoias, things like that.
Right.
The mass
formation
that goes
psychosis.
on. Mass formations. Yep. So there's, but one of the most important points from Pathocracy that he makes repeatedly, the way he phrases it is, one type of evil opens the door for another.
Yeah.
And so if we look at the macro dynamic, look at the as above, well, depending on your perspective, which is above and which is below. But if we look at the cultural domain and this idea of the cultural or civilizational dark night, where things fall apart, people lose touch with their values, and but if we try to look at that dynamic and what Lobachevsky's talking about when one door opens another, he basically says that every kind of evil that he's talking about in his context, like these big political evils dealing with psychopathy and political psychopathy, he says repeatedly, he's kind of trying to make he's trying to avoid getting people to be too egotistical about it, because he always tries to remind the reader, well, but you got to remember that every time there's an evil like that, the people that opened the door were normal people who fell down on the job.
Yep.
Right. That their own moral failings and weaknesses and their own, greed and laziness and whatever is what opened the door to that other kind of evil.
Right.
And so there's a similar, again, if we take that now down into the level of the individual, there's a similar dynamic that goes on there. And of course, these will be related to those cultural dynamics, where probably the first evil that opens that door for an individual is that repression of the material that we don't want to look at, that we can't acknowledge. Lobachevsky calls them self-critical associations. So these are thoughts that we might have about ourselves that are negative, that we don't want to look at because they make us look bad. And because they make us look bad, they make us feel bad. So we repress it. And that causes all kinds of effects downstream. It messes with our thinking processes because we can't, because we don't have that like ease of transfer, but across that boundary layer that you were talking about.
Yeah.
We're not thinking with the right material. So we're going to come to wrong conclusions about things. We're not going to see things objectively. And when we don't see the world objectively and ourselves objectively, we're going to run up against roadblocks, so to speak. We're going to think that something's in front of us when it's not, and we're going to run into a billboard. Right. And these are the like the signs that our subconscious is giving us, in a sense, that, okay, something is not going right here. You've got some things you have to look at, and until you look at them, these things are going to keep going wrong in certain ways.
Yes.
So that's one way of looking at that first evil, and at various points.
So
in
the
book,
first evil is repressing your personal shadow.
That's what that's what I'm saying off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about it some more, but
Yeah. That's there's a quote in there from Marie-Louise von Franz, who was one of Jung's associates, and of how this happened to Germany, of how, the Jungians have kind of two main categories of the shadow, the personal and the archetypal. And she says, this is how it happened to the Germans. They fell into the archetypal shadow through the personal shadow. And so, the example she gave was, it's taken from a film that she was in, where she says, once the Nazis came to power, people joined in with that movement because they didn't want to get fired from their job. And so she said there was greed in their personal shadow. But I would say there was fear. I wouldn't necessarily say it was greed, but there was fear of being rejected fear of being thrown out on the street, fear of survival, fear of rejection in their personal shadow. And then that led them into a movement that itself that is like, it's like batteries connected in series. Actually, are they in parallel or in series? I have to think about that. But batteries connected together to get more current. I guess in parallel, you get more current. In series, you get more voltage. Can't remember. But when you get all these human cells together, and they all have similar constitutions, or let's say they're all repressing shadow material similarly, then they become a group circuit which is now focused in a particular way, and they become incredibly destructive. And then they channel as a group. You get this group hysteria or group projection, and then you get access to, you don't just dump your personal shadow out when you join in with one of these movements. You don't just get to displace your personal frustrations through it, but you actually become a channel through which the most ancient genetic patterns of evil are stored and personified. And so that's how individuals in a movement can actually become demonic or satanic, and especially the leader or leaders of the movement. They will then embody the shadow archetype that everybody is collectively, pulling together. And so, if you were more transparent with yourself, if you knew more about your own weaknesses and your own shadow material, so to speak, if you had already been, had already had some experience in facing your own personal darkness and experience in being courageous in the face of your personal darkness through life experience, then when these kinds of things come around and you are pressured to join in with the group who is now possessed by the archetype, you will basically say, no, that's not for me. And you'll be able to resist, and you'll be able to get out of there and not participate in that. But if you don't have that experience, and you're sort of just always, at this certain level of consciousness right here, and you don't have that kind of depth, and you don't understand much about your own feelings and your own drives, well, then it's very easy to go, to get hypnotized by a group and then join in with a group and start. And I think we probably should define kind of projection, or how that works, because just real quickly, it's pretty simple, really. But when this is what happens, this is what we do with our shadow material, is that we have that boundary field, we have that natural kind of inbuilt wall that shoves everything toxic into the closet, so to speak. And then it has to go somewhere. So either we displace it through some kind of fighting or self-destructive behavior, or racing at 140 miles an hour on the highway, or getting into fights at a bar, or shooting ourselves up with heroin or whatever, or however we're going to do it. And those are more extreme versions. But however we displace different kinds of shadow emotions, because the way we behave the way we displace will be related to the shadow material that needs to be displaced. So if it's rage, it'll be more aggressive. But if it's grief or guilt, it'll be more self-destructive. It will be more inward moving, and we'll do these displacement behaviors in different ways. So we either will displace that way, or we'll displace online, with the keyboard warrior stuff and arguing with people over, who's better, Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whatever, and or activism in the streets. And, you can see that the more the crazy and sort of unhinged the activists are, the more you can recognize that they're displacing, they're using that modality, that behavior, to be able to move a lot of pent up, repressed, very toxic energy. And so that's sort of the physical way that we move this energy out. You can also do it in sublimate it, which is more of a positive way of doing it. So you can turn, let's say, sexual drives. You can actually, have a healthy sexual relationship and put your sexual drives into that. Or you can get involved in martial arts or boxing or some other kind of warrior training or whatever, where you get your aggression out in a healthy way. Or even, sitting around with your buddies and watching football and yelling at the TV and stuff and rooting for your team and all of that is actually a lot healthier than getting into a fight with somebody on the street. So that's a healthy way also of moving shadow material. So the material has to come out one way or another. And if you don't have the type of personality that lets it go out, then you're going to self-destruct. You're going to get all kinds of diseases. You're going to get all kinds of syndromes. It's going to lead to all kinds of chronic illness and all that. So that's another way that it can come back on itself. But the sort of way that it works with the externalizing of the shadow is that it starts with projection. So with projection, before we can get involved in an activist movement and start displacing our rage, we will generate the simulated reality that we need to be able to rationalize our behavior. So we have to create some kind of theater, some kind of simulated reality so that we can go, oh yeah, that's my cause. I have to stop that evil out there. I have to stop those evil Republicans or Democrats or whatever it is, or, terrorists of this, that, or whatever it is. And, heathens or Christians or whoever you're demonizing. And so what we do is we project, and so that's the process of taking the actual shadow material that we are repressing and throwing it on another person and painting them with the brush dipped in our own shadow material. So we make him the evil one or her the evil one out there. We make that group the evil ideology. That's the evil empire over there. The Soviet Union is the evil empire, and we are the good, righteous people over here who are trying to bring democracy to the world. And then once you're politically red-pilled, you see what a sham that is, and how that, there's nothing, and that, just because, America is having a economic and maybe philosophical upswing, and so they're doing very well economically or whatever, and maybe they've won some wars, and so they're doing well. And so you would think that they're the good guy because you go look over at the Soviet Union and it's all falling apart and dilapidated and all that. And you think, okay, those guys must be the bad guys. But you don't see all the festering shadow toxicity and parasitism and corruption that's going on in America. So you're trapped in the persona of America. You see the fake, the false mask of America, and you think, yeah, we're the good guys, and they're the bad guys. But you're not. You're in denial, and then you're denying your own shadow and projecting it onto the Soviet Union or to Afghanistan or this or that group or whoever it is. And what the real reality of it is that you have your nation or your people have their own particular sort of culture of evil. And then over there, they have their particular culture of evil. And you've nailed them on theirs, or you think you have, but you've denied yourself. And in a lot of what you think is their evil is actually your evil. You said that it's so funny when I look at the way the current American political establishment is constantly talking about Putin and what he thinks and what he wants, and he's going to do this, and he is a dictator, and he just wants to take all of Europe and all of this kind of stuff. And I'm like, no, that's everything you guys want. You guys have 800 bases all over the world encroaching on everybody else. So that's projection.
You
and it
want to be the new USSR.
Exactly. So we project personally and personal things when we're having disputes at the personal level, and then we collectivize around a collective projection, and then we all agree. Here's the demons. These are the demons. These are the good guys. This is the righteous. This is the evil. And then we collectivize, and as long as everybody stays to the script, then you get a lot of energy. You get to displace all your rage and aggression onto the other side, and then you get to get ego inflated and hubristic and about yourself and how great you are at the same time. So you get a rush off the whole thing. That's how projection works.
So, Colin, one of the things that you brought up earlier was the kind of cyclical nature of the shadow. And this is even in spite of any kind of dark night of the soul or experience that's flattened us, where we've realized a bunch of things and that was initiatory or extremely painful. There is still, even as we move forward with ourselves and looking at the world stage and red-pilled information, so-called, you still seem to be suggesting, I think, that there's work to be done on ourselves that's ongoing. And so
right.
you present a lot of really useful modalities and ways of clearing the shadow within ourselves and of engaging in the process in as I would say in as gentle but productive a way as possible.
You're good.
And I thought that was a real value to the book, because I had seen several of these things that you mentioned, all in different places. I had Les Fermi's book on my bookshelf, and after I read your bit about meditation, I ran to my bookshelf and I thought, oh yeah, I have this book. I should really re-engage in meditation, maybe in some different ways than I've been doing it already. So I wonder if you would speak a little bit to the fact that this isn't a one and done thing, working on ourselves. And in fact, there are so many intense world events and things that we are observing in the world right now that it has to, by necessity, be an ongoing practice of working with our shadows and our psychology and emotions.
It's like health. It's like a lifestyle. It's like a healthy lifestyle type of a thing. And that's one of the reasons why I framed the shadow in Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, because then you could see that if you look at this, if you use, we could go into this, but if you realize that the Jung's shadow, the dark side of our consciousness, is in one quadrant, the upper left-hand quadrant in Wilber's work. Well, then what's in the upper right-hand quadrant is disease in the body. And then in the lower left-hand quadrant, it's evil in the culture. And in the lower right-hand quadrant, it's all the ways in which our civilization, our society becomes parasitic or destructive. So once you kind of see that framework, then you realize, oh, okay, well, this is a holistic way of interfacing with ourselves and the world, where we're basically looking for transparency and cleanliness and health in all domains of reality. And there's a lot of people now who are waking up to living a healthy lifestyle, and they're eating clean, and they're participating in some kind of yoga or martial art or something like that, or they're exercising regularly and they're being conscious about their health. Well, this is really just a continuation of that. It's just health on the psychological side. And you could say that, well, that's what the Eastern spiritual practices are about. That's what the different types of Indian yogas or the Taoist and Buddhist Zen type practices of the East are. They're about mental clarity and cleanliness and mindfulness and transparency of the mind, of the psyche. And that's true. And so that's been ramping up in the West. We've been bringing those Eastern understandings over for maybe the last 100 years now. But the difference with the Western tradition, which is the Jungian tradition, is those Eastern spiritual practices, they don't really touch so much on the shadow per se. They don't really, they're kind of about, get out of your ego, kind of non-dual states and kind of transcend Maya and all of that. Whereas in this practice and this science, it's alchemy. It's alchemy. And they have there are alchemical yogas and Chinese alchemy, in Chinese internal alchemy. There is that kind of an understanding in the East, but it's much smaller. So with alchemy, you're taking something raw and unprocessed, and you're heating it up, and you're breaking it down, and you're separating it out, and you're refining what comes out of that, and you're reheating and re-breaking down. And you're making a finer and a finer and finer solvent out of something that was raw and impure to start with. So that's the alchemical, and I would say kind of the Western esoteric spiritual practice that Jung was basically recapitulating and bringing into 20th century language and science and putting that back on the table. So this is a practice of internal alchemy that is a constant, daily. It's a lifestyle. It's a life. It's a way of. It's just like I said it with health. It's a healthy lifestyle. It's about internal transparency and internal clarity and internal processing of our dark stuff, our yucky stuff, our garbage, our toxicity into genius, into something light. And this kind of touches on the idea, also Jungian idea of the golden shadow, in that, we usually associate the shadow with dark stuff or with evil. And even the term shadow assumes that it's dark, but it's really just a psychological process to hold back from our egos that which we are not capable of taking in. And that happens to be a lot of dark stuff, but it also happens to be a lot of light stuff too. And so, we also project, we don't just project our dark stuff onto other people and see them as evil, but we also idolize other people. We idolize this hero out there in the world. And basically that's what the Jungians call golden shadow projection, where you have the reason why you like that person out there in the world. You see that hero out there in the world and you think, wow, they're so light and they're so good and they're doing so much good for the world and all of that. And they're so brilliant and whatever their capacity is. But really what you're noticing in them is something that's undeveloped in yourself that you haven't been able to metabolize into your own ego. You see that great athlete out there, or that great philosopher, scholar, or politician, or whatever it is, and you haven't really been able to cope with the fact that you are kind of like them. you are also great like they are in that way. And the reason why you see them as so great is because that's also a part of you that's within you that needs to be developed, but you're afraid of your own greatness. You intuit that if you were to touch your own gold, as the Jungians say, then it could blow you up. You could be like Icarus and, get too high on your own supply and then burn up. And so you tamp down on it. You say, okay, no, I'm not going to go for that. That's just too wild and grandiose. And so you keep yourself small. And so, so that's part of, I kind of went off the track a little bit on that, but back to the way that this is a lifestyle, the way that this is a psychological health lifestyle. This is yoga. I mean, we know, most people know yoga in the West as hatha yoga, which is like stretching and physical yoga, but yoga is a philosophy, and there's different versions of this, that deals with all domains of human reality. And so that's what this does too. This alchemy is about clarifying and processing what is unrefined, whether it's negative and so to speak evil, or whether it's potentially gold that's just unrefined and it's your genius that needs to be refined. And slowly but surely you need to come into contact with your own genius in a way so that you can accept yourself as the unique genius that you are. And so that's all part of this refinement process. And if you have all these fears, and if you're not familiar with you just become familiar, like with anything that you study and you work on or for a while. It's like we were talking about when the internet went out or whatever, the technician that's going to come over there could be a thousand different things that could go wrong, but he's going to say, okay, looking at the situation, I'm familiar with what could go wrong, so I think it's probably going to be this. Well, if no one is really studying their own psychology and they're not looking at their own shadow material, whether it's dark or light, and they're not becoming familiar with the communication that's coming up from the unconscious into the conscious, if they're not familiar with the way that we dump our shadow material, whether it's dark by demonizing people or light by idolizing people, we dump our own stuff onto others. If we're not familiar with how we're projecting and how our whole reality is basically a projection, if we're not familiar with any kinds of tools for bringing ourselves into balance, we're going to be basket cases. And that's what we are as a society. We're turning into basket cases. And so we as a people are absolutely psychologically illiterate. And it's kind of like we're economically illiterate. We're illiterate about the legal system, about how the government works. We're illiterate about a lot of things that we need to know about. As a society, we're pretty darn good at coming up with technology, putting rockets into space and making, internet and stuff like that, and computers. We're really good with that. For whatever reason, our society is really kind of hyper focused on this technology thing, and we've excelled in that way. And then we've just sort of left all this other stuff to the side, and we haven't focused on that. So I think that's part of that's part of the civilizational downswing we're in right now, is that we're realizing that we were way too focused in this one area. And there's a whole lot of stuff that we were neglecting, and getting in, becoming aware of health and what we're eating and exercise and all that kind of stuff. That's the first step to this. What I'm talking about here, this is, I don't know how many steps ahead of that it is. Maybe it's just one step ahead of that, hopefully. But it's where we're saying, okay, no, I can't just run around distracted, exoteric in the world all the time. Everything that I deal with is exoteric. I have to have an internal practice. I have to have an inward facing focus to at least somewhat balance my because we're naturally inclined to be externally facing, so we could survive in the world. But with the way society is now, we have to develop an interfacing modality. So, and then what you said about the practice is, I was wondering how I was going to kind of frame all of that, because if you start looking around for shadow work, and Jung himself, he has his certain areas of shadow work that, and how he took people through that, becoming aware of your projections and studying your dreams and using art and to get access to unconscious material. But there's been new stuff has come up since his time, and almost all of it is dealing with the psyche. And so I was wondering, okay, well, it's not dealing with other areas of life. And once I realized that, you can frame the shadow in all these different ways, and you can see it through these different quadrants in Ken Wilber's understanding, or holons, or as above, so below, you can see it in different domains. Then I was like, well, we can't just have shadow work. If the shadow can be seen in society, in culture, in the body, and in the mind, well, then shadow work has to take place in society, in the culture, in the body, and the mind. And so I'd had that, I'd been kind of working with that for a long time, but I hadn't really put it down on paper. And so what I did with that was, the primary area of doing shadow work is psychological work. But then I put some ideas out there for how to become transparent and clean in these other areas of life, and how to interface with those other domains in a way that would qualify as shadow work. And so I put that out there. And what's more important to me, actually, is that people understand the framework. It's really it's kind of like, are you going to go fishing for people, or are you going to teach people how to fish? And so that's kind of what I want to do here. Is I want to say, hey, everybody, here's a framework, or a few frameworks for understanding these unconscious dynamics and how they're leading to evil in the world and disease and destruction of every kind, personal and collective. Here's some frameworks for understanding that. And here's some frameworks for doing work to bring clarity and health in these areas. Now you take the model and go fill it in with whatever you want. I could just create a workbook where I kind of just leave most of it blank, and I say, do something in this area, come up with something in this area. That's more, I think more important, is that people just start thinking in these holistic terms, in this sort of second tier approach. And then you can do whatever you want with it from there. There's a tremendous amount of evolution and novelty and invention that can come out of, it can go into understanding our shadows and doing shadow work. There's a tremendous amount of it's just like a latent gold mine that's just sitting there, just waiting for us to take it up. And and the end result of it is alchemy. You are refining something impure into something pure and very powerful and evolutionary, if you will do the work, and if you will accept the mission.
Cool. Well, I think we'll maybe have just one more little exchange here.
Yeah, no problem.
Before we call it a night. But so I want to bring it back to projection. And I liked the comments that you made about the golden shadow projection, because I hadn't encountered that before. I hadn't read that. That's a really good, really interesting way of looking at it. So I want to make a couple comments on projection that I've been thinking about since I read these parts in your book, and so I'm trying to put some ideas together to try to even just talking today has helped somewhat refine these thoughts. So I want to I want to hear your thoughts on them too.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you feedback on anything. I'd love to.
So a couple ideas. First of all, there's the idea that when you're projecting, one of the signs of the projection is like the energy behind it, right? There's an intensity that goes on. Like when you see evil in the world, there's an intensity, and an energy and an emotion like that's tied to it. And that seems to be a sign that there's some projection going on of the inner shadow. Triggering, right. Now, that doesn't mean that you're wrong, right? Because you can be latched onto a target that actually, oh, wow, that person actually is doing a lot of evil. So it's kind of independent of whether or not you're right about the target. There's still projection
related,
going on.
but somewhat independent.
Right. So you can be like, you can be identify an authentic agent of evil in the world and still be projecting your own stuff onto that person. And that can be kind of responsible for the energy behind it. I think, or at least some of the energy.
You got it. That's it.
And so that's one thing.
Right.
Now what might the response be? So there's two more things. What might the response be when you've actually kind of done a lot of shadow work? And so what would the difference be between someone who's like projecting their stuff onto another person and someone who's kind of dealt with some of their shadow work, who's looking at that same stuff in the world, that same person or those same people that, you might be objectively say, oh, those are pretty nasty people, right? That might be a serial killer. One of my ideas, and this kind of relates to Lobachevsky's work in Pathocracy, is that you might be seeing the same thing, but in a much more detached, objective and scientific view, right? It's not going to eat at you the same way. You're not going to have the same visceral like response to it. It's like, okay, well, that's what that is, right?
Right. The Buddhists call that right action. Right. Have you heard of that? Right action?
Yeah.
It's balanced action, right? Right. So you don't stop somebody's, you have some corrupt politician in your town or whatever, and they're, ripping everybody off or whatever it is. You don't, and it's really getting to you. You don't just walk away from it and say, well, that's just me projecting, that can't be real. What it is that if you're at this, more balanced, coming from this more balanced place, and you have experience in this area and you've been dealing with that, you realize that, hey, wait a minute, there's a reason why I latched on to this guy. Why did I find this guy? I could go talk to my neighbor. They don't know who this guy is. I found this guy, and there's something about this guy's particular corruption or about him that's really getting to me and making me really want to take this guy out or whatever it is, go do something, run against him in a political race or go expose him to the city council or whatever it is. There's something about him. And so the more detached way is the right action way. And it's the way where you get involved to clean the situation up, but you're not an obsessive, compulsive addict over the whole thing. And when you're feeling like an obsessive, compulsive addict, that's when you know that you're projecting and displacing. But it doesn't mean that you won't do anything about it. It just means that it won't be an obsession. It could even be a project. It can be, it's just and it's very interesting because once you do become aware of what the evil out there is partially your projection. And if you're successful in being able to trace it back to an impulse in yourself, in an image in yourself, and you realize, oh, this guy reminds me of my own father that I have a bad relationship with, or my own uncle that I have a bad relationship with, or this person reminds me of some abusive boss or whatever, and you've tapped into a shadow archetype and you're projecting that onto them. It doesn't mean that they aren't channeling that shadow archetype, but you can't trust yourself that you're seeing it clearly. And once you've gotten into it in yourself and started to kind of clear that out of yourself and brought that up, what you'll find is that your energy will start to balance out, and you'll start to kind of lose that that very addictive, compulsive energy, and then it may completely reorient you, and you may find that the strategy that you are going to use to deal with that situation with that corrupt politician or whatever it is we're dealing with, is actually probably not the best strategy. Maybe the best strategy is to come at it from another place, from the side or whatever. And maybe this guy's already collapsing in on himself. And maybe the better thing to do is go to the city council with some other, maybe form another group, another nonprofit or something like that, that comes in with a solution. And then by you getting a city council member to adopt your solution, that puts pressure on the other part of the system, the parasitic side of the system, and it furthers its collapse. So maybe there are other ways of dealing with the problem that are much more efficient, more symbiotic, don't turn you into a lunatic, and that are just a cleaner way of dealing with the situation. That's the progress that you can make once you rescind your shadow, so to speak.
Right. That relates to something that Lobachevsky talks about again, repeatedly in the book. Is he talks about the danger of the moralizing response. And the way I read him talking about the moralizing response, it's that intense response. It's that intense moralizing response that that it's like, oh, well, these people are evil and we must eliminate them. And it's the emotion behind that he says, yeah, well, that's what humanity has always done, and it has never quite worked out for us. So maybe there's another way. And I think what you're kind of presenting is an individual psychological path towards that other way. And I think,
and we don't even know once we start to kind of crowdsource this, we don't even know what we can come up with. Once not everybody, once a significant number, a minority, let's say, of individuals. It's kind of like with the red pill crowd right now. They're presenting a significant problem to the powers that be, so to speak, just by being there and just constantly looking at everything and targeting everything. They're changing the dynamic. So what if there was a category of people who were literate in this psychological area and were doing this work on themselves, and then they were talking about it and bringing it into the public? We don't even know what kind of chain reaction that could cause, because the way that those mass hysterias work is that is this what Matthias Desmet, I'm sure you know his work, is talking about, saying that when you have this impulse for a group to form around some kind of a projection, a scapegoating, a demonizing projection that's happening, and you have one of these toxic hysterias happening, you have to stand your ground, and you have to be. It's kind of like they say with disease, and why the idea of a virus and disease is a perfect analogy for the way this shadow material moves collectively. And that the way you deal with a disease, the correct way, is that people who are immune get into the social body and they become blockers of it. And so by you becoming immune to the collective hysteria disease and just staying in your workplace, and when people are trying to, or wherever it is in your movement, like I was actually participating in the Occupy movement, the San Francisco one. I was out there in 2011, and I wasn't as informed as I am now about all of this, but I was watching their unconscious hysteria, and I would get involved in some of these conversations, and I would kind of sort of turn their focus around, and they didn't like it. It breaks up their trance. And so if you have enough people who are aware of how this works and start pointing out, no, I think you're projecting, and let me explain to you how this works, and I can understand why you think this about this person, but here's what happens if we all do this, and blah, 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 and you talk them down off the ledge. So we don't know what kind of progress could occur when a percentage of us will go into into society with this kind of knowledge and start sharing it with people. It's like throwing it throws a wet blanket on the whole situation. It starts to put out the fire. And so, we don't know how much progress we can make when this understanding becomes more ubiquitous.
Awesome. All right. Well,
Yeah.
Once again, Colin, your website is shadowtechalchemy.com. The new book is Transforming Darkness, a Shadow Work Toolkit for the Red-Pilled Initiate. Is there anywhere else that people can go to find you and your work, or is that the best?
Yeah, that's probably the best place. There's links to this is the preview version of the book. It says not for sale, resale on there, but by the time this interview comes out, it'll be available. And then I also have a previous book I wrote with my partner, Melissa Mari, called Shadow Tech, Cracking the Codes of Personal and Collective Darkness. These are both, I'm going to have a package actually as a PDF, so you could get both of those together. And so there's that. And I would just welcome anyone who's getting this to go. I mean, I'm just open for more interviews, for conversations, for anything, so that we can, just really kind of take this to the next level. And I really appreciate you guys bringing me on, because we're in the same camp, and we're just looking at the same stuff from a different angle. And I also believe that the Pathocracy angle is extremely important. And we could say the same thing I said about the shadow. What if a lot of people in the red-pilled freedom movement, or whatever would read Pathocracy or watch your program and get up to speed on this, and then start actually using psychological language and understanding these personality disorders, and recognizing how that we're projecting onto psychopaths. That's actually what's happening in a lot of cases. We're projecting our own gold onto people that should not be carrying our gold for us. And so there's a lot of progress that can be made with the Pathocracy angle. The only problem I see with that is then they become the new demons, and then we're going to have to start testing everybody for psychopathy, which I think is probably a good idea if you could get a reliable test for getting into government or into corporations. I think that would be good in a way, but then they would become the new demons, and everybody would be trying to,
It requires a psychological maturity and a psychological literacy. I think they would come hand in hand. I think the more psychologically literate people are, the less would be their tendency to engage in that kind of demonization.
You're right. You're right. The common person, though, would hinge onto this and be like, "Oh, yeah, they're right. These are psychopaths, and you need to leave now. You're a psychopath," and it would just energize their activism. Mm-hmm. And then, but would they be able to tell the difference? Would they actually be able to really tell the difference between a healthy, mature person who's just on the top of their game and a malignant narcissist?
Yeah, hard to say.
Many can't.
Let's see.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something that I said to Colin before the start of the show. Read the whole book. Short book.
Appreciate you doing
great
that.
book.
Yeah.
And your writing style was very clear.
Thank you.
I think for our audience in particular, most of the people who tune into MindMatters, right up your alley, and a great reminder of a lot of concepts that we've discussed in previous shows and in articles and in other forums that we might participate in. It's a great summation for the work on the self. So I really enjoyed it, Colin. I want to thank you again for reaching out to us. I hope we do this again sometime. Yeah. I think there's a lot more to discuss here.
Please, let's do it. Yeah, as much as you want. There's not a whole lot of avenues that have been opened yet. One last thing is, when you do find people who are talking about the shadow and talking about psychology, they don't tend to be in this sort of red pill community. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. There's all kind of Jungians and all kind of people. Yeah, I could find all kinds of Jungians to go talk to and all of that, but they're delicate. A lot of them are delicate, and a lot of people who deal with psychology and inner work and healing are you kind of have to be very careful. and I'm kind of more of a warrior about it. And I'm glad that you said that I did the shadow work stuff delicately, because I tried to, because I don't want to, get Alex Jones about the whole thing.
Although I guess there's a place for that too.
There's only room for one Alex Jones.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay, fantastic. I look forward to doing it again.
All right. Thanks, Colin.